The UK vows again to change a controversial law after Israel threatens to halt its special strategic dialogue with Britain to protest against possible arrest warrants. Is London about to make serious concessions, sacrificing universal jurisdiction for bilateral relations with Israel? What signals is the UK sending to the world regarding its attitude to war crimes? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. The British government has vowed to amend the law after Israeli officials decided not to attend strategic discussions with Britain in London. The universal jurisdiction law allows foreign nationals visiting the United Kingdom to be arrested for alleged war crimes. Israel made the announcement shortly after Britain's Foreign Secretary William Hague arrived in Israel for a two-day visit. Israel and Britain had begun what is referred to as a strategic dialogue 2 years ago in an effort to boost relations between the two countries. And with the British government now vowing to amend this current universal jurisdiction law, Britain appears keen to hold on to its relationship with Israel.
It's important that Israeli politicians are able to visit the United Kingdom. We are changing the law. It doesn't just affect Israel, it can affect other countries as well, so that any arrest in the United Kingdom as a universal jurisdiction would have to be one that had a reasonable prospect of a prosecution, so that it is not used for trivial or political reasons. And we will soon be putting our proposed changes in the law to the British Parliament on that, and they will go through.
Earlier this week, Israeli Intelligence Minister Dan Meridor cancelled a trip to London due to concerns that he might be detained. But this is not the first incident. In September of 2005, an arrest warrant was issued for a former head of Israeli forces, General Doron Almog. He flew back to Israel after being warned that he may be detained should he disembark at a UK airport. In October of 2009, military chief Moshe Yaalon cancelled a UK visit amid fears he too would be arrested on war crimes charges. And in December of 2009, an arrest warrant was issued in the UK for Tzipi Livni for suspected war crimes during the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip the previous year. Well, joining us now to discuss this issue are our guests. In Tel Aviv, Dan Shufton. He's the director of the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa. In Oslo, Mark Taylor, an international legal analyst. And on the phone from London, Jeremy Corbyn, an MP for the Labour Party from Islington North and a founding member of Stop the War Coalition. Welcome to you all. And let me start with Mark Taylor in Oslo. What is wrong with the principle of international or universal jurisdiction? Should the law be changed?
In my view, definitely not. I think that the fundamental problem with accountability for international crimes is continuing impunity for those crimes. And that whether it's in the Middle East or Africa or frankly in Europe or North America, other parts of the world, that increasingly the history of international law is a movement towards holding those most responsible for those crimes accountable in courts of law.
Well,
universal jurisdiction is crucial for doing that.
Well, if it is crucial, is there any legal justification for the UK government to say that it needs to amend this law, or would it simply be caving into political pressure?
I think there's no question that it is caving into political pressure in this case. There are, of course, legal principles that every country will implement on its own. Countries are sovereign states. They will implement laws as they see fit. And other countries have done the same as Britain, which is to retreat on the question of universal jurisdiction. It's a shame, I'm afraid, for Britain. It's a problem for international justice. It's a problem for justice in Britain as well.
Jeremy Corbyn, is the UK genuinely concerned that this law could be misused?
Well, the government...
Or is it perhaps trying to appease the government of Israel?
It's clear to me that this is a process to appease the government of Israel politically, because under the current UK law, anybody can apply to a judge, and if the judge has prima facie evidence against an individual of committing war crimes or abuses of human rights, then an arrest warrant would be issued and the case would get to court. What the government wants to do, the British government, is to remove the opportunity for the individual to do that, and therefore the only person who could issue an arrest warrant would be on an application to a judge from the Attorney General, which takes it straight into the political arena, as the Attorney General is politically appointed. And because of the history of the Pinochet case in Britain and of the arrest warrants against a number of Israelis, including Zippy Livni, the government is under great pressure to change the law. I have to say that it's going to be a big battle in Parliament, because those of us that believe very strongly in universal jurisdiction on human rights and war crimes issues are going to fight this all the way, because I don't want this country to become a playground for war criminals. I want them to face justice here, just as they should anywhere else.
But is the UK government, in addition to appeasing governments like the Israeli strategic allies, is it also worried that if this went ahead, then its own nationals, its own officials could face similar prosecutions elsewhere?
There isn't an issue relating to that, because if a British official is accused of a war crime, or prima facie evidence against them of a war crime, and they end up in a jurisdiction which does allow that arrest to take place, then that arrest would take place. And we went into the International Criminal Court process with our eyes open. We're fully aware of all this, and I saw that as a very big step forward, and I'm very disappointed that the British government appears to be now caving in to pressure from Israel because of the wholly legitimate concerns of the Goldstone inquiry and others about the use of illegal weapons and bombing of civilian targets during Operation Cast Lead.
Dan Shufton, let me turn to you, Director of National Security Studies Center at University of Haifa. What is the main concern here for Israel? If Israel is a country that is truly committed to the universal human rights principles, to the rule of law, should it then be embracing such international systems of justice?
No, I don't think Israel will do it, and I definitely believe that it will be abolished in Britain as it was abolished in Spain and in Belgium and in other places, because it is basically a propaganda ploy. It has nothing whatsoever to do with justice, because it gives every radical, particularly from the very radical left, an opportunity to use it as propaganda.
But we're not talking about propaganda. We're talking about potentially very serious crimes of human rights and war crimes. This isn't propaganda.
Yes, it has to do with propaganda, because every radical can appeal to every judge who's not qualified to deal with these issues, and every judge can issue such a warrant, and this is exclusively a measure of propaganda, because the very fact that somebody is detained and accused is in itself already perceived as a major achievement for the radicals who want to pursue it. Now, that's not only a problem of Israel. Very soon you'll get it with the United States, very soon you'll get it with Britain, and every nation will be open to it in a way that will make international relations impossible, and therefore I have no doubt that Britain will follow the other countries who abolish this practice. I don't think there is the slightest chance that it will prevail. Maybe it will take a few more months before it is abolished, but it will be abolished.
Mark Taylor, what do you think? Will it be abolished? Will we see more European countries caving in and withdrawing some of the arrest warrants that they've issued in the past?
Well, I think what you're hearing from Mr. Shifton and that kind of argument is precisely the politicized nature of what should be really very much a legal question. The pushback against universal jurisdiction is coming from those political elites that are threatened by it. And I think that that's one of the problems with the strategies of the campaigners that have tried to pursue some of these cases, is that by going after political leaders, they've opened up the possibility that political elites who are potentially vulnerable, whether they're in Israel or the UK, US, or elsewhere, to push back and to seek those laws changed. We have seen similar processes in Belgium and in Spain, not least when those elites themselves have felt themselves threatened. The case of Spain is a very good example, where previously campaigning judges took cases against people like General Pinochet in a groundbreaking case. That judge was now forced into exile because he attempted to do the same thing against his own counterparts in Spain who may have been involved in crimes under the Franco dictatorship in Spain. So these are very politicized questions. The fact of the matter is, however, that the real problem has to do with impunity and whether or not the law of rule, the rule of law is going to be replaced by the law of rule, and that power will govern. If we want a justice or a international system based on international law, then we submit ourselves to the law as equals. And I think that runs for Israel as well as it does for the UK.
And we've mentioned some of the countries that have applied the principle of universal justice. Britain, of course, isn't the only country that has signed up to it. We have Belgium, which has enacted a similar law in 1993. It was used a few years later to prosecute human rights violations during Rwanda's civil war. Victims of a 1991 US airstrike in Iraq tried to file a lawsuit against US President George Bush Sr. and several of his top aides. The Belgian government scrapped the law in 2003, though. After then, US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld threatened to move the NATO headquarters from Brussels. Spain also enacted a law allowing its courts to try war criminals. It issued an arrest warrant for Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. The law has since been amended. Charges must now have a clear and direct link to Spain. Jeremy Corbyn, we've looked at some of the limitations that have been imposed on some of these jurisdictions. How much of a genuinely viable option, then, is international justice?
Well, the more that countries retreat away from the principle of international law and universal jurisdiction, then international law becomes a bit of a joke, because it's impossible then to prosecute somebody for war crimes. And I think Dan's argument that this somehow opens the door for radicals to go and influence judges is slightly bizarre. We are dealing with judges who have to examine prima facie evidence against an individual. They don't willy-nilly issue arrest warrants. What they have to do is examine the evidence, and if there is a reasonable case being made against an individual, then an arrest warrant would be issued. What this will mean is that those people who have ordered illegal activities, abuse of human rights anywhere in the world will have more and more places that they can go to and not be subject to arrest, because there will be a political decision made by the governments of those countries to offer them protection. And I think this is a very, very sad process. And if Dan wants to really think about it, this is actually very damaging for the cause of human rights everywhere in the world. It's not just about the question of Operation Cast Lead and what happened in Gaza at that time. It has implications for what happened in Rwanda, as you pointed out. It has implications for what has happened in Colombia and other places where there has been significant evidence of abuses of human rights by forces of the state.
Dan Shufton, your reaction?
Well, first of all, the whole issue of international relations is political. The only thing that will now happen, if we will have something like the British government is doing today, more extensively used in the world, is politicizing the legal system as well. Again, by radicals, usually from the extreme left, using it as a propaganda ploy.
But isn't Israel, though, being extremely selective? Let me, Dan Shufton, remind you of an incident that happened in the early 1960s. Didn't Israel back then apply its own version of universal jurisdiction when it sent its Mossad agents to Argentina to abduct Adolf Eichmann, who was seen as the architect of the Holocaust, and to bring him to trial in Jerusalem in 1961? He was hanged for crimes that he'd committed, supposedly, in Germany. Isn't this some kind of universal jurisdiction?
Yes. No, it isn't universal jurisdiction, because he was judged in Israel and we kidnapped him from Argentina.
But he was tried for crimes that were not committed in Israel.
Case of a very extreme individual. Yes, this is true. He was tried in Israel, the Jewish state, for crimes he committed against the Jewish people. In the very extreme case, only one of its kind that ever happened in human history, of a total obliteration of a whole people, and this person did it. So if you take the very extreme cases, you see, this is the problem that you have with every attempt to take things ad absurdum. If you take the one extreme case in history where this is justified, and by the way, Israel only did it once, and it was done on this basis only once, and then you apply it for every propagandist who wants to make a name for himself, and every unqualified judge who's unqualified to deal with these issues, certainly when they happen in another country and has nothing whatsoever to do with the country where he's a judge. He studied the laws of his own country. He's totally unqualified to do it. We have an international criminal justice forum that could deal with these issues. This is also problematic because it is politicized, but here you can more or less accept it. The
Jeremy
problem
Corbyn,
is that the whole issue of human rights was hijacked by the
respond to
radicals.
this.
Well, I think it's not really very sensible to keep on talking about unqualified judges. Judges are qualified, otherwise they wouldn't be judges. They're qualified to make a judgment. That's why they're there. And I think it's very silly to keep on with that particular line. The issue of universal jurisdiction is an important one. Britain, in order to prosecute war criminals from the Nazi period, passed the War Crimes Act in Britain, which I actually supported the passing of it because I thought that those monstrous people that committed the war crimes during the Second World War and during the Nazi period should be prosecuted and indeed are liable to prosecution in Britain. The passage of the International Criminal Court statute was a major step forward because it created the principle of an international jurisdiction. What we now have is a concerted effort pushed by Israel with a number of other friendly states such as Belgium and France going along with it to push back the whole principle of universal jurisdiction and therefore protection of individuals anywhere in the world against gross abuses of human rights. Dan needs to think about this because this issue is going to be a very backward step and a great day for all those that routinely abuse human rights and have caused war crimes in conflicts in all parts of the world.
Mark Taylor, if it is so important to keep this legal concept and if the judicial system in countries like the United Kingdom is so independent, why aren't we seeing then arrest warrants for US and other military and political officials suspected of war crimes in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan? And now there is a fairly substantive body of documentary evidence that was contained in the latest WikiLeaks documents.
Yeah, it's a very good example and it's a very good question. I don't have the answer. I suspect that it goes back to what I said earlier about the political elites of those countries politicizing attempts and therefore attempts to avoid the law. I think we need to keep in mind, however, that there are other forms of what's known as extraterritorial jurisdiction that can be applied when nationals are either victims or perpetrators of crimes committed abroad, and that universal jurisdiction is only one form of extraterritorial jurisdiction. So I think that Israelis, Americans, leaders of Arab countries that are in conflict and others that are in conflict are going to have to continue to look over their shoulder at the long arm of the law, whether it's in the UK or internationally in The Hague. I would also like to add that the process of going after senior commanders, political leaders, others who are deemed by international law to be most responsible for these kinds of crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. This is a relatively new development in international law in the sense that it's only been reactivated in the last 5 to 10 years after, previously it was the Second World War, Israel's case against Eichmann in Jerusalem, and then only since since the turn of the century has there really been cases pursued against people like Charles Taylor, who is now on trial, the former Liberian dictator who's now on trial in The Hague, the case referred by the Security Council for Omar Bashir to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. These are cases that are going forward. If we continue to take on those cases in places like Africa and allow exemptions for European leaders or for North American leaders or for our allies, I think international law will be increasingly in a crisis of legitimacy.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbyn, this does smack of imperial behavior, doesn't it? I mean, in many cases, one cannot imagine that the United Kingdom or the US government would welcome their own nationals, their own soldiers to be prosecuted by countries in the South under this same principle.
They wouldn't. They probably wouldn't welcome it, but there was a very intense debate in the British Parliament over the Rome Statute to establish the International Criminal Court, and this very point was raised about the behaviour or otherwise of British forces or indeed anybody else's forces around the world. And by the very existence of international law and of universal jurisdiction, it does help to alter the behaviour of governments, of states, of armies, and in conflict, thereby enhancing the possibility of bringing about more justice and human rights. What we have now is a very imperious approach that somehow or other some people in some countries are above the law. The United States has never signed the International Criminal Court statute. Israel is now trying to pressurize European countries into withdrawing universal jurisdiction. This is a very bad day and a very backward backward move that's been taken. And I think those that are pushing it should think very carefully about their place in history and the implications of doing this.
Dan Schuftman, what is the alternative then to this principle of universal jurisdiction? The Israeli government always says that it is investigating its own behavior, the behavior of its own troops. But quite frankly, a lot of people feel that it isn't doing so seriously enough. And the ICC stipulates that if a country isn't willing or isn't able to investigate itself, then it needs to be done by an international court.
Well, first of all, Israel is prosecuting its own soldiers and its own decision makers when it comes to what is perceived to be as a conduct in war that is inappropriate. We've had a minister of defense removed, we've had soldiers put in jail and so on. And if people don't accept this, it's very often because you have a very hostile press, particularly on the left in Britain, that will distort every report that comes out of Israel. But let me just look at the bigger picture. If this practice continues, then Obama cannot visit the United Kingdom because somebody will approach a judge who's unqualified. And again, I don't mean that the judge is unqualified to be a judge, but he is qualified to judge according to British law. He studied British law. So he's qualified in a very, very narrow sense. But then the Chancellor of Germany cannot come to visit London. The Prime Minister of Britain cannot visit the world, because it's enough if one radical will apply to one judge, and this one, he will decide to make a name for himself and do something spectacular so that everybody notices him.
Mark Taylor,
this
is that a fair point?
The whole conduct of international relations impossible.
Could the application of this law make it a bit too chaotic in that now it's just a handful of countries that have applied it, but if many countries brought charges against visiting officials, the situation could become very, very much out of control?
Why? Would it not be a good idea that those foreign officials traveling abroad have made sure that they're not involved in those kinds of crimes? I think that's an important incentive for those officials to make sure that when they're making decisions in which people's lives are at stake, they're thinking twice before doing so, or probably 4 or 5 times before doing so. I'm not so sure that chaos in the international system is really a big issue here. What's really at issue is whether or not we're going to hold accountable those few people who we see as have good evidence of being involved in those kinds of crimes. The number of senior leaders that have been prosecuted for this thing, I could count on one hand. So we are really talking about a tiny number. We're talking about a relatively new development in international law. And the idea of chaos in international diplomacy is simply, frankly, absurd.
Mark Taylor in Oslo, thanks very much. Thank you to Jeremy Corbyn as well, joining us on the phone from London. And in Tel Aviv, Dan Schuftman. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us, and thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. Of course, your comments and suggestions are always welcome. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From all of us here, thanks for watching.